Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is I, Rob, here once more in my dungeon lair. And I'm going to do something I haven't done in a long time. And that is give you my state of the dungeon for one of my campaigns. Because it is over. As of this point, the state of the dungeon of my Warhammer 40,000 game, focusing on the Adeptus Arbites of my playing group, has come to a conclusion. So this State of the Union will be recapping the last State of the Dungeon that I had done on this campaign. Was done for the session on June 28th, 2018. That's a while ago. Not quite a full year, but it's been a while. During that time, we've had several play sessions, of course. We have missed a lot of play sessions, so not as many as you might think as far as what we've done, but it covered a lot of ground. So this is going to kind of sum up what happened, and in a very general sense. I'm not going to, it's kind of hard to bullet point individually what happened week after week. Some of it has escaped my memory. Some of it was... Honestly, if I could give a summary of this campaign and our experiences therein, it would be kind of a comedy of errors. It was typified by a lot of circumstances where it seemed like everybody either rolled really, really well or really, really badly. And the amount of fate points that were used to keep the party afloat was pretty epic. Almost every night, everybody had lost at least a point or two, and some people had lost a few. We had people who were crippled, who had to burn fate points to stay alive. We had cybernetic replacements for some parts. It was, quite honestly, a pretty brutal campaign, as you might expect considering the subject material. Another of the things that typified the game was that the players had discretion on whatever direction they wanted to go. They could be the badass Judge Dredd type Arbites. They did not have oversight for a lot of the campaign. They were left to their own devices to handle things in their own way. And they generally chose to be pretty decent. They had a job to do, and when something bad happened, they didn't sit and moan about it and wring their hands. They had a job to do, and they did it. And for the most part, they did it in pretty exemplary fashion. They did take some non-traditional methods. But I just want to give an overview of the entirety of the campaign, more so than go session by session by session. That's cheating you out of a little bit, but like I said, quite honestly, a lot of the details on how they played can be covered by the State of the Dungeons that took place for a single week session at a time. This is going to be kind of an overview of the entirety of the game. As I look at my notes, I realize that half of the campaign, fully half of it, took place after I stopped posting. The first session was on January 18th of 2018, and it continued on until June the 28th. So 5 months I did character witnesses, more or less, and since then we've had quite a few sessions. So basically, the premise of the game was their characters were drafted together to fill holes in a squad of arbitrators. They were given quick education on the basic tenets of the job, because the battle group for the arbitrators that were being sent into a planet that had recently been reclaimed from warp storms, the planet Vigilance, needed arbitrators. So they went to non-traditional methods to do this. At several planets, lots of planets were all uncovered. Vigilance was the one that looked like it needed help and guidance the least. as per its name, Vigilance, the planet had been very vigilant during its time that it was cut off from the rest of the Imperium, because the planet was a very pious planet. The Adeptus Ministorum, the Emperor's ministry, had done a fantastic job of keeping the spirits of the people up, even while they were separated from the rest of the Imperium. So, as a result, when the Arbitrators got there, they weren't needed to immediately start executing traitors and bring the planet back under heel. The governor himself had welcomed the Imperium with open arms. They had filled up their quotas for their deliveries and had everything ready to be offloaded to help the Imperial machine. They had done their duty. Everything looked fine. So as a result, there was only the one group of arbitrators who were sent, which were the slapdash arbitrators, led by Ryder, who was a scion of the Sculla Progenium, I believe. And, he was a hive worlder who was trained to in the techniques of the arbitrators. So he was sent to captain the team, again led by Ryder, but consisting of Fade, who was a diviner psyker. So that led a little, questionable stuff. And the assassin, Raynor, sniper expert. Eventually, they liaised with a tech priest, GPS. Still never liked the name, but eh. And they had a guardsman, Rex, who, brilliant at combat. Pretty much any aspect of combat he was really good at. So with that cluster, they were sent down, either freshly minted arbitrators or a junior arbitrator sent to pacify the planet, whatever needed to be done. Their ship was shot down as they arrived at the planet. Missile came and took out their craft, and it crashed into one of the hives. Hives, for those who don't know, Warhammer 40K are structures that are basically huge cities that are walled and can house billions of people. In fact, the one that they crash into housed 20 billion people, all in a huge walled city full of prefabricated buildings and broken up into tech fiefdoms. The planet was under the jurisdiction of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Brotherhood of Mars, who is responsible for all of the machinery and technology that the Imperium uses. This planet could have easily turned into a forge world, but instead it was given over for the production of delicate materials, not things that could just be mass-produced, but things that required people and their skills to actually go in and make. More of a cottage industry of sorts. They used technology that the tech priests guarded jealously against each other so that their particular specialties could not be impinged upon by their rivals. So it was a unique circumstance for these arbitrators to come in. There was a precinct fortress there, a huge tower in the middle of one of the hives, the hive they crashed into, that actually pierced through all the different levels of the hive. The downside was the arbitrators that had manned it over 100 years ago when the warp storms took the planet, they all died and gave up their duties and perished. With the exception of one, the Marshal, who they would come to meet later. And the tower was basically inert. So, one of the first things they did, they met the local death cult, the Ophidian cult, who were a licensed death cult, but didn't take kindly to the rivals of new arbitrators, so they were fired upon when they arrived. They made it to the precinct fortress. They got the power system back up. GPS was very useful there. They also liaised with an administratum clerk who was tasked to help them out. His name was Yamas. He was a GM NPC, and basically he was there to cut through the red tape for them. He did not actually participate in, I don't believe, any of the tactical combats. The group, over time, got the precinct fortress up and running, made contacts with the Ministorum to get people, to get bodies to help out. The Ministorum was more than happy to send them urchins and trainers so that they could have the staffing they needed. They worked well with the Administratum, who were eager to get another branch of the Ordos on planet to help with organization and maintaining order. Not that the planet was all that rowdy, but there were still defined gangs around who warred and had their own influence. Some of the tech priests themselves plotted against each other, so the addition of the Arbites was welcomed by the Administratum, who like order and things to go smoothly. And as such, they gave them vital support when they could. The group branched out and met the local black marketeers, as there was a very fine industry of tech heresy, theft, and smuggling, occasionally murder. But all the same, the Arbites aren't all just purely police. They're mostly there to stop treason and the onset of, the incursions of chaos and all the other naughtiness. And this planet didn't seem to have a lot of that, so they actually were able to go with a fairly light hand, and they made some arrangements with the underworld, stressing they weren't there to oust them, but they needed to control themselves, which seemed to be amenable. They made allies with the local gang that controlled the territory around the precinct fortress, the Zoners, because the leader, Red Max, was a very pious person who believed that it was his duty to help the Arbites, despite the fact that he controlled a powerful gang in the middle of this hive. And the group could have gone out guns blazing and brought people to heel, but honestly they didn't. They worked within their own system and the system that existed, and did a fairly fine job for the most part. As things went on, however, it became quite clear that the Ophidian cult was not going to leave them alone. It was determined that these Arbites were not welcome, and that they had to be eliminated. The group found out also that they had been infiltrated by Chaos cultists who had arrived from a freighter that they eventually found was brought in specifically by one of the Archimagoses, the heads of the Adeptus Mechanicus. And this kind of set them off on a lot of investigating. So the game became basically down to two parts. They would attack the cultists that they knew harbored these chaos cultists, weather an attack from them, and then just do more digging and investigating, making alliances with the local gun designers. Technically guilty of some tech heresy, but honestly the group needed an edge, so they were willing to blink at some of the tech heresy, including the tech priest, who kind of was enamored with some of the decisions they were making, he himself being very ambitious and really skirting the line of orthodoxy. Jumping across the line when he had an opportunity, but it worked out for him fairly well. Along the way, there were some lighthearted moments. They had a malfunctioning Medicae servitor. For those, again, who are not savvy with Warhammer 40K, servitors are usually criminals who have their bodies turned over to service for the Emperor. Most of their personality is scooped out. Mechanical bits are put onto their body to help them do their new job, and they are seen as mindless slave labor, effectively. The fact that it comes on the bodies of criminals, and sometimes the not-so-criminal, it's just part of how the Imperium goes. Bodies are cheap and plentiful, so they're a resource that are used often, not just for throwing into the fires of war. Eventually, they really started to hardcore go after the Ophidian cult, especially since the cult showed they weren't playing around, conducting missile strikes and sniping actions on them as they were moving out through the city. So they were determined to go after them, eventually finding that in one of their cults they had actually housed a demon host, that is, a psyker who has been twisted over to the effects of chaos. In the final battle, they had actually sided with the Adeptus Ministorum to battle this significant foe. And the party all learned way too much heretical knowledge about demons, but they were also in a privileged position that the Ministorum wasn't able to purge them, so They knew stuff. They kept their sanity for the most part, but they were ready to continue on after they had been thoroughly checked and cleansed by the Ministorum, who have techniques on how to reduce personal corruption. There was a great deal of fighting, which led to the slaughter of several of the commanders and lieutenants in the Ophidian cult. The group had met a few other people of influential power, including a noble who had been slumming it. She eventually proved quite useful for her connections. And then the group found out that they were not abandoned completely. When it became clear that they were having some difficulties, a judge was sent to assist them with his staff. So Judge Calamitous Cinder came to help them out, and he arrived with a cadre of his hand-picked lieutenant colonels, who all had their own specialty and were there basically to kickstart an entire planet's worth of Arbites control. However, finding out that, again, there wasn't a great criminal element that really needed to be stomped out, Cinder instead took his people and put them in positions to help rehabilitate the planet, bring it up to code so that it could begin tithing appropriately, setting up the distribution lines, and he had them not just sit in the fortress. He constantly had them sent out. The acting lieutenant colonel that the group had to worry about was Lieutenant Colonel Antweiler, who was sent over them to supervise and kind of direct them. Antweiler realized that the group had a lot of personal initiative and already had boots on the ground, so he gave them a really light leash, giving them direction where he was ordered to, but allowing them to do most of the investigating themselves from that point on. At this point, a number of things, really started to happen. For the most part, the group was fixated on the chaos issue. They backtracked from the freighter that arrived to drop off the chaos cultists, where everything seemed to be accelerating. Which was a number of people and a couple of murders that were accomplished, but were kind of glossed over. It was a little suspicious, but the party didn't have a great deal of information at this point to suspect members inside the Mechanicus. So they went forward trying to sniff out where these Chaos Cultists had gone to ground. They had already killed one Chaos Psyker. They were ready for more. So they were given a mission to go underground in disguise and blend into the duties of one of the... Actually, I'm going to go back one time. One of the things that they did, and which gave them a very useful ally, was they were sent to investigate the attempted murder of the Archmagos of a particular tech fiefdom. His name was Severin, and he was responsible for design and production of combat servitors, the ones with really big, scary guns and weapons. He found out that there was a plot to kill him, so the party had to go into his place, and using their skills of investigation and a fair amount of intuition and stubbornness, eventually they tracked the whole thing around to find out that Severin had instituted the plot to test out these new Arbites and see if they were any good. They passed the test, and they got themselves a really good ally. It was one of my better adventure cycles, I think, because they really did do a lot of good investigation and intuition. And I thought that was one of the things that would really make this kind of game work, and it did. They did a really good job. I was really happy that they didn't just kind of gawp through it and try to resolve things with a bunch of dice rolls. It was pretty awesome. They detailed at least 3 separate plans to take out the Archmagos, and eventually tailed those off from dead ends, blinds, and misdirection, and found out that only the Archmagos himself could have ordered some of the techniques to kill him. So, they next were sent underground without any resources to go and infiltrate the labor production of another Archmagos, so that they could try to flush out and identify these chaos cultists. So Ryder went in as floor labor because he's built and he's enormous and powerful, and pretty much came to rule the roost for the sub-spire tower that contained millions of labor for this particular tech fiefdom. The others all took a variety of jobs. Hilarity kind of ensued, and for some, they did a really good job of sniffing out, finding out that the Ophidian cult had members that were there, and they prioritized eliminating the cult lieutenant who they found, which they did with prejudice. They got some useful toys, but again, their investigation came to a head when they found out that the entire labor spire had been rigged to blow in a particular pattern that would have attracted the attentions of a powerful demon of Corn, the god of murder and bloodshed. So they put an end to that plan. They basically defused the bombs. There was an impressive amount of fighting, killing chaos cultists where they were entrenched, and they did an excellent job defusing it, taking out the Promethean bombs, and eventually ending up in a nice pitched battle against the head of the cultists. This ran us through until late into last year. And there were some good moments of role-playing involved, but it was some just, really good fighting that took place. Fighting with combat servitors and so on and so forth. And this time it was replaced by large agents of chaos, mutants, and psyker witches. They really got to hating one or two psyker witches. There were some interesting characters that came up. They met an unlicensed psyker who helped them out, who had powers of probability manipulation, which worked out for them and kind of kept the spirit of what's possible being unbounded, because mutations keep happening and psychers don't always fit in neat little boxes. They got to have a pretty good relationship with Antweiler, who was coolly competent, but did not overlord the group and oversee everything they did. And they got a good CO. They actually even ended up having a fairly good time, although scared, with Judge Cinder, who I enjoyed playing with my Emperor Palpatine voice. So you did your investigation, did you? It was fun. I enjoyed the character. Again, he was also archly competent himself and helped the group and directed things, but for the most part, I put him as the person who would directly deal with the Archmagi, dealt with the Administratum, and took care of all of that stuff that the group really wasn't angled for them. And their jobs got a lot easier after he arrived, because they no longer had to worry about administration, flow, chain, stepping on the toes of the Adeptus Mechanicus. That's what he was there for, to kind of change and guide the rest of the story. There were some running gags throughout. For example, Raynor, played by the youngest person in the group, had some interesting personality quirks. He was brash and impulsive and kept making mistakes that ended up getting him knocked out or injured, which is not good for a sniper. So he had to learn some discretion and how to do his job by some painful lessons. Also a cybernetic spine, a replacement leg, and a replacement arm, which he got a birthday present of a tech heresy arm with a variety of powers. He could randomly boop, 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 boop on his arm and find out things. I was inspired by The Greatest American Hero, a TV show from the 80s, where this guy was given a supersuit by aliens, but he lost the instruction manual. So he had to try to work things out. Basically, he did the same thing, except I kept having pieces of paper show up, and the paper, when he would find them, would have a code that will tell him another power. at least 2 of them could have blown him up, but he avoided those. But a lot of them were kind of interesting powers that would cause him problems when he would indiscreetly use this bit of tech heresy that was clearly alien technology. He didn't always have the most discretion for that. And, sometimes that would cost him. And he also was obsessed with, bigger and bigger guns, as is common for this game. There's a lot of wanting cool toys. The coolest toy he ended up finding out was another device that had been claimed in an old investigation ages ago, but it was a fusion of a plasma cannon and a heavy flamer by using the, mechanics of it aren't important, but it was sealed away in the vault, and he just took to that, desired it with an intensity that defied personal, keeping himself safe. He sometimes went to extremes that he could have been executed for, but he didn't. And in the very last session, he actually got to play with it. So it was Fade, the Psyker, who kind of had this interesting... He had a really kind of a neat character where he was constantly aware that he was one outbreak away from being executed. But the player himself liked to push the edge and kind of was rooting for his psychic powers to go crazy, and he had the most miraculous run where nothing bad happened, carried all the way through to the end. Even though he was getting more and more powerful and the chances of disaster or something crazy happening never really happened, except for earlier in his career where it was all manageable. He had incredible luck with his psychic powers. Also proved to be pretty devastating. He ended up getting a hand cannon and proving that was a devastating weapon in his hands. And as a divination psyker, he had an ability where he could guarantee hit when he shot. So, yeah, he ended up being very useful in fights, as well as using his psychometry, which I enjoyed playing around with some of his powers and letting him do more cool things with them rather than just the rote things that the book had. I love psychic powers in this game because they're not... I don't like them being cookie cutters and this can only do this, this can only do this. If you roll well and your power can do something similar, I go with it. Unfortunately, the player who was playing the Tech Priest, GPS, was not always present because of his circumstances. When he was here, the player was insightful, very resourceful, and oftentimes came up with solutions way outside of, I shoot my gun at it. As a matter of fact, it was rare when he was actually shooting his gun at things. But he found ways to be effective in a lot of other manners and got the players through challenging situations. Rex, the guardsman, wrecked things consistently. His combat skills never petered off. He started being brilliant. He changed his tactics halfway. He got a cool Archaeotech battle rifle, which was great, but then after a while they realized that they could get shock mauls, and shock mauls are devastating weapons. So then he enjoyed the melee side of his character being quite good too, and he developed into being devastating at any range, being very reliable for the group, which was kind of important because that wasn't always the case. The other thing about Raynor, the sniper, is that his luck was terrible. Oftentimes, he would go through his luck like candy at a second grade. And yeah, sometimes he could be amazing, just smoking difficult opponents with a single shot. Sometimes he was lucky he didn't just drop his gun when he tried to shoot it. Ryder, on the other hand, the actual arbitrator, was a good leader. The others really eventually ended up respecting that he knew what he was doing. He gave the group direction and drive. He was their moral compass, oftentimes, which was kind of funny to see. And he became a devastating combat monster, too, capable of taking incredible punishment, becoming one with his shock shield and shock maul, and just, delivering the Emperor's justice where he needed to, throwing himself at the biggest and nastiest things, coming under heavy fire. He had been critically injured numerous times, but kept weathering through it, sometimes fighting when he probably should have held back, but was a very, very compelling character. So these were all things that happened through the story. Eventually, the group had finished off with the rest of the cults, and they ended up getting to the end game. The end game found them getting information about the true culprit, who was one Archmagos Blight. Semyon Blight, who was generally responsible for all of the problem. They also found out that a large part of the reason why the planet was so stable and why the different gangs didn't cause great amounts of bloodshed and mayhem was there was a ghost in the shell. Turns out that there had been a marooned salamander of the Space Marines librarian, the psychers of the lot. His name was Kaz, and he stayed in the shadows, which isn't easy when you're 9 foot tall with glowing red eyes, but he stayed and he manipulated people using his powers, which he specialized in powers that could, he was an empath. He was good at making people feel and think certain things and be more loyal, and he used that sparingly, but directed people to work together better. They eventually found him, met with him, and got more information about Blight. Then they went in to make their move. They were sent by Cinder. Well, first of all, they went to deliver their information to the Precinct Fortress, and found out that it had been attacked by these Chaos cultists. Turns out there was more than what was delivered at that from that freighter. And they had infiltrated the tech priests and had basically locked down the Precinct Fortress. So they had to fight their way through it, eventually rescuing the judge from the tech priest who was infected first, who they eliminated with extreme prejudice. The judge ordered them to go to the spaceport and make sure that this particular tech priest did not escape the planet. So they locked down the spaceport. At this time, they had craft and flyers and vehicles that could get them places quickly. When they arrived at the spaceport, there was an attempt on their lives from an exploding cart. And they found out that the Archmagos that they were looking for was the one responsible for making exterminatus grade weapons, the kind of weapons that could utterly destroy an entire world that had been given up for lost by either the Imperial Navy, the Inquisition, or the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. So they knew the stakes. The planet was at risk of being destroyed. They found out that this particular tech priest had gone mad and sided with Chaos, but he had lots of schemes within schemes. So they were determined to stop him. After they had shut down the spaceport, they flew back under direction of the judge to get more information, to basically return, deal with the gangs, get enough labor together, and they were going to go and attack the stronghold of the Archmagos, together with the other members of the Adeptus Mechanicus who were not compromised, which is fortunately most of them. But they went back to Severin and asked him for their help, and he pledged assistance to directly make the assault. Devastating as it would be to the planet, it was important to cut that cancer out. But then the players found out that one of the things about the Precinct Fortress they didn't know about it was that it had a teleportarium. And they found out information-wise that something had teleported into their base through their receiver. They found out that one of the weapons had been delivered to the fortress. So they got their way through the fortress, found out that the Psy Witch that they had thought died was there. She had changed her shape to appear to be one of the lieutenant colonels and had brought this to the sub-basement of the fortress, which they found out was actually a huge, extremely powerful teleportarium that could teleport something into space through void shields. They actually had a plan to attack the Arbites battle cruiser when it came back to visit the planet, which it was due to do. Well, big battle ensued. They didn't find out that the Chaos Sorcerer Witch was actually the twin sister, the one they killed, but it didn't really matter. They still dealt with her with extreme prejudice. The judge got to nail her with his Thunderhammer, and the party just went in and shredded her. However, they were saved from her counter rebuttal, which would have been messy because Kaz showed up, the Salamander Librarian who blocked her power and let them finish her off. They then came to the conclusion, we have a powerful teleportarium that can go through void shields. Can it also go into a bunker by an extremely powerful Archmagos? Yes, it could. So they teleported to the final battle, which was very resourceful and wasn't in my original plans. But we went with it. It was the final night of the campaign. So they appeared, and they found out that the Archmagos' plan was he had a rocket. And he had a powerful lance weapon through the roof of his bunker. He was going to blast a hole through the hive, up, fly out, and get out into space without having to rely on the spaceport. He had been doing this for a while. They also figured that he had one of those Exterminatus weapons on board his craft, so to give him protection, maybe? Or that he was going to, in an insane fit, just detonate it and destroy the planet. Big battle ensued. Ryder eventually broke off and went directly after the Archmagos, while the rest of them cleaned up his guards, a bunch of corrupted tech priests who had been touched by chaos, so there was some mutations along with their cybernetics. There were a couple of combat servitors who were, again, mutants. It was messy, but there was a lot of good fighting that went on. And Rex tried to sabotage the rocket by cutting away its supports with his melt-a-gun. Raynor just fired his plasma cannon flamer that he was finally allowed to have and damaged the outside of the rocket. There was a lot of hacking and fighting on ground level. That was mostly the judge. Kaz tried to stop the rocket by summoning a giant flaming serpentine drake. That didn't work. And, for the most part, it was a great fight where everybody had something to do. GPS stopped the servitors using his binary speech, trying to turn them against the Archmagos. He couldn't turn them against the Archmagos, but he basically stopped two powerful combatants from getting into the fight, which was very effective. The Psyker, Fade, went up, used his abilities and his weapons to basically help out a little bit of everywhere. He didn't have a great opportunity to do much to the Archmagos, who shot and almost critically wounded Ryder, but the Archmagos got into the ship. Ryder got into the ship after him by making brilliant tech use rolls to get the most out of the jetpack that he was equipped with, and he got into the body of the ship. When he got in, he found out that the rocket was a shell. Inside was an actual space orbiter, a true ship, that basically the rocket was just going to peel apart and help him to launch the ship out. So while the others were destroying the outer casing of the rocket, it really wasn't going to have a great deal of impact. So, the rocket fires. This, because it was splitting out, the ship was coming out of the rocket. The Promethium tanks on the rocket blew up. So everybody had to get out of that room where they were going to cook, even in their nice carapace armor. So GPS and the judge ran out and got out before the bulkhead doors shut on the hangar. The others used jetpacks to get up through the channel that had been cleared by the ship, which left Ryder inside the ship with the Archmagos. The Archmagos had gotten up to the cockpit already. Ryder was on the outside. He slid down with his power sword stuck in the side of the ship and then he hacked his own way with his second power sword. Yeah, they were geared up pretty well for this fight. And opened a way in. Got into the cargo container with the weapon. And he tried to detonate the failsafe switch that the cockpit could basically detonate the weapon. When he did that, he found out that there was a dead man switch on it, and it was starting to warm up the bomb. Kaz appeared because he had an ability to teleport through flame, from one flame to the other, so he came up into the craft, and he said, when this reaches critical temperature, it'll ignite, and it will destroy everything. Right now, if it's destroyed, it'll explode, but it won't kill everybody. As a matter of fact, now that we're out of the hive, it'll detonate fairly harmlessly. So I'll take care of this. Ryder's like, you're a space marine. I'm just a human. You go, I'll take care of this. And Kaz said, you're extremely brave, and I will not deny you this honor. For him, it wasn't a matter of, that he would have died. Kaz was perfectly ready to, but he acknowledged that sacrifice was an honorable thing, and he allowed Ryder to take that. So Ryder turned around, flourished his power swords, and 3 swipes in, blew it up, killed Blight, stopped that exterminatus weapon from reaching critical mass where it would have incinerated the entire atmosphere. Just left a very pretty explosion. Ryder was no more. The rest of the group who had flown up with their jetpacks got to see the explosion. Nobody saw Kaz. What happened to him? So, the day was saved, and the Arbites had won. I did not give them a denouement because it was late that night. Very, very late. So I'll do that here now, and I will be posting this to our personal channel, Have Basement Will Game, so that they can hear the denouement. This is what happens from this point on. On Vigilance, about an hour after the detonation of the rocket, the battleship of the Inspector General, which is the Gavel of Justice? Justice's Gavel. Close. Arrived in orbit around the planet, coming hotly out of warp. They delivered a large contingent of fresh arbitrators, enforcers, and all of the other staff required to properly process the planet. They determined that there was a need for chapter precincts around the different hives, not only focused on one hive. So, the individual exposure of the Arbites grew tremendously. The surviving arbitrators, Fade, formerly of the Imperius Icana, was promoted to lieutenant and became an inspector lieutenant. His psi powers allowed him to serve with distinction, and he was never actually terminated in the course of his duties. He actually managed to earn high honor, even though he wasn't ever given probably the proper amount of credit. His deft use of his psi powers allowed him to uncover numerous crimes, and eventually allowed the Arbites on the planet to expand their coverage and responsibility of duties so that even the planet-side enforcers, who were not of the Arbites, would come to him for his advice and assistance, which, again, he served with distinction. Raynor never lost his impulsiveness, and his record was marred repeatedly by promotions followed by demotions for his reckless behavior. He never really left the ranks of the arbitrators. However, they did ask him to become an instructor, marksmanship primarily. So he was allowed to serve for the remainder of his time on Vigilance. However, after a certain amount of time, there was a bit of a falling out, and he was transferred off-planet. So his term on the planet of Vigilance only lasted 5 more years. He was given some minor distinctions for feats of marksmanship and occasionally eliminating a particularly nasty or sticky opponent. Again, usually from a couple streets away, but for the most part, his diligence and things would not give him the same distinction as some of the others had. Rex eventually was promoted a couple of times, but lieutenant was his last acting role. Lieutenant Arbitrator. He was very, very popular as an instructor, as well as being a acting chief enforcer primarily. He, as a matter of fact, trained some of the finest enforcers that the sector had seen. His guardsman skills and dogged determination made him a perfect fit for the group. And as a result, he served also with distinction many a time. In fact, it was commended upward to the Inspector General that agents of distinction within the Guard be considered for transfer to the Adeptus Arbites for pacification and general duty. This, however, fell on deaf ears, but it's still of note that it's in record. And somewhere in the passage of the Book of Judgment, there is a segment on the practicality of involving the guardsmen in responsibilities of the Arbites. GPS was unfortunately dogged by reports of impropriety and a lack of orthodoxy with his techniques. The Ordos Biologus basically welcomed him on a hunt throughout the planet of Vigilance for some rogue AI, which the group had investigated somewhat. Strangely enough, GPS went kind of off the grid, but he still has the distinction of being one of the highest ranking members of the Adeptus Arbites, who also has a pledge of fealty to the Brotherhood of Mars, and as such holds peerage in both places. Unfortunately, nobody knows the location, and for some reason all records of GPS have been scrubbed, only recreated occasionally by those who served with him, primarily his comrades in the group. Of note, about 3 weeks after the events that ended the campaign, the Precinct Fortress was presented with a statue. Not just any statue, it was a 15-foot tall statue of Raynor. The likeness was uncanny. Standing there flourishing 2 power swords, quite clearly the detail was amazing, much as he was in the final mission that ended up allowing him to be martyred to the Emperor. One thing that was curious, though, that nobody quite understood, one important detail that was different as far as the rest of the party ever knew. Unlike the actual armor that he wore, it was almost perfect, but on his left shoulder piece for the carapace armor, there's a symbol clearly engraved of a tongue of flame that was not there on his armor when he wore it. Still, that still stands in the Precinct Fortress and will for, well, foreseeable eternity, as long as the planet still exists. That was made of adamantite. Again, where the adamantite came from or who crafted something that required such working materials, no one ever says for sure, but the people who were there have a good idea. Of the conspirators against the Emperor, those who sided with Blight, they were eventually rounded up and brought to justice. Eventually, other problems would arise, as they always do in this blood-soaked, chaotic universe. But when those things come up, there are arbitrators standing between them and the innocent people of the world. This ends the story, and it was a good story. Certainly do look forward to the next time when we enter this universe, but I'm retiring my notebook. These notes will go into record. I don't know if that's the last we'll see of Vigilance. It was an entertaining world, and I think the party did really well with it. So, I hope you found this enjoyable, and for my party, I hope this wraps things up to your satisfaction. I look forward to the next adventure, and we'll make some more stories. Thank you, and farewell.